to just drop us an email at theturingway@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me personally or Arielle. The information should be in the Etherpad, and if not, we'll update it now. And just as a reminder, and I'll shut up now, we'll be holding the room for an extra 30 minutes after the discussion. And that will be unrecorded, so we can have the most open discussion ever. It is totally optional as well, so you can just drop off afterwards or stay there. But usually ends up in a very interesting conversation. So with this, I'll just pass it to Arielle to kick off today's session.
And I'm actually handing over to my co-host, Jen Tridgell, to take us through this part of the discussion.
Thank you for that excellent introduction, and I'm delighted to be here co-hosting with Arielle today. I'm going to jump across to our speakers to give a quick introduction of themselves, their name, affiliation, and then I'll come back to the opening question. Dawn, would you like to go first?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Dawn Foster. I am the Director of Data Science at the CHAOSS project, but I actually have a pretty deep experience in open source. I've been doing this for more than 25 years. A lot of that has been spent in corporate open source program offices. And until recently, I was also the co-chair of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation Technical Advisory Group for Contributor Strategy, where I helped lead their governance working group. So providing governance reviews for Cloud Native Computing Foundation projects. So that's kind of my background on governance.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dawn. Richard.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Littauer. I am one of the co-directors of CURIOSS, along with Clare Dillon, who you're going to hear from in a second. CURIOSS is quite longly named the Community for University and Research Institutions Open Source Program Offices. Long way of saying we help people who have an office in a university talk to each other. I've also been doing a lot of other stuff, like Dawn. I've been around for way too long, which is really nice. No offense, Dawn, sorry. I've been around too long. I don't know. Anyway. I've been helping run this organization called Sustain Open Source Software for a long time and hosted hundreds of podcasts about sustaining open source, a lot of which have touched on governance. I also used to run a consultancy where I'd help people figure out how to build their open source and make it better. And was an open source developer before I decided that coding is just no fun and I'd rather talk to people. So in order to avoid the spelling issue where I just talk too much, I'm just going to go Claire. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Richard. And as Richard mentioned, I work also in the CURIOSS project, which I will not lengthen. But our community is one that is global. It's we have members, about 60 individual members from about 26 institutions, mostly in the US, but also in the EU. I do not have as much experience as either Dawn or Richard. Relatively, I suppose, new to the open source community. My background is more in the corporate technology world. But my interest area in recent years is, I suppose, looking at some of the governance and maybe the differences that are in place between, for example, what might be required in the corporate world and then in public organizations like academic organizations, and then more broadly when we're thinking about the potential different governance models that may happen in different contexts, whether it be domain specific or indeed regionally specific. So that's one of the interest areas I have.
Thank you so much. And as you would have just heard, we have a tremendously rich expertise from our speakers today and from other participants in the room. I'm sure it's going to be a very rich discussion. And with that, I'll kick off with the opening question. How have governance approaches in open source evolved over time from your perspective? Has this been for better, for worse, or neutral? Who would like to start? I'm going to pick.
I can start.
Dawn then. Yes. Fantastic.
Yeah, so I think governance has changed tremendously over the years that I've been involved in open source. At the beginning, we had a lot of benevolent dictators and we had not a lot of documented governance. So a lot of the governance in open source projects wasn't really written down. People didn't really have robust governance structures, robust decision making. processes. As a result, I think we learned a lot from that because when things go wrong, they tend to go horribly wrong. And if you don't have governance in place to handle it, it can be really difficult. So I think now we have documented governance, we have robust governance structures, we have kind of commonly accepted ways of doing this, which makes it a lot easier for projects to put governance in place. And so I think it's a tremendous improvement, especially in the last 5 to 10 years.
Claire or Richard?
I agree with Dawn about the general open source movement if we're thinking about like GitHub or GitLab. I entered as a developer doing JavaScript in the early days of Node. So that was like 2010s. And yeah, we've gone from PDFLs, Benevolent Dictator for Life, to like now we have governance strategies. We have governance.md in our GitHub folders. That's great. But open source is a lot larger than that project. Open source is a massive thing that I think is really hard to conceptualize as a concept. I actually don't like the term at all. At the end of the day, it kind of just means putting a license on some code. And open source licenses existed in the 90s between massive corporations that were doing stuff. And governance in that case was, well, I'm your boss. And yes, we have this under this license, but like at the end of the day, that's it. And so what's really interesting to me isn't just the open source ecosystem that Don and I were sort of talking about before, but also the wider scheme where now we're seeing governance playing into all sorts of different things. We have academic open source governance that's very different and also sort of built out. We have industrial governance, which still exists in its own way. And you still see, you know, big news articles about this major thing changing or not. We also at this point have governmental governance issues. We have acts being passed by the EU, like the Cyber Resiliency Acts. We have White House directives. We have national fires and international issues where things like the FBI get involved with governance issues about who's in charge of this software that went bad. And so it's really an interesting topic to think about how things have changed. I think the awareness that, oh, this code needs someone in charge of it is like, everyone knows that now. And that's cool. So that's been a change. Whether or not we fixed, I'm in charge of it all the time. Claire?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think some of these issues for me have been what I've been learning over the last number of years is that difference between the idea, like the kind of personal governance as in code of conducts and how everyone acts with each other and what you do in those scenarios and the amount of great resources that are there for that and patterns for how to deal with scenarios. You know, that's been a wonderful learning experience from my perspective about how that's all grown. And I think that's quite robust maybe in terms of helping people go through that. That idea of the kind of project level, like where you put your governance.md file and like how, whether it's a BDFL managed project, whether you have multiple people or it's in a foundation, all of those sort of things. I'm not sure if people understand perhaps at that level, you know, what might be a trigger point for perhaps moving from one governance model to another. So in that, maybe we have a better understanding of what some of these models look like. There does seem to be sometimes scenarios where something might trigger someone moving from one to the other. And I'm thinking more along the lines, again, of what Richard was saying. You know, one of the things I've, I suppose, observed in the last little while is that there's more and more discussions about perhaps filtering the adoption of open source through governance. So it's the idea being that like there's a lot of discussion now about if governments are adopting open source projects, well then what checks need to be in place, you know, whether or not they do have software bills of materials, whether they are single vendor projects, what geographical region they originate from. Like these sorts of things are starting to be filters that I think people are looking at. And I suppose one bigger question I have from all of that is how is that impacting the adoption of open source in the future, and whether or not that may break some of the value that we've had in the open source ecosystem where people have felt that the free flow of projects has been the thing that's been most useful. But the question, one of the questions I've been thinking about lately is that as we start thinking about governance as a kind of a measure, then is that going to somehow put a filter on what gets used where? And to Richard's point, even from a region-specific thing, things like the Cyber Resiliency Act that's requiring things from projects and things like that, or for what people use it's interesting to look at that from a perspective of what's starting to be required, or even for things like funders who are now perhaps looking for more specific checklists of the research outputs that they may actually be funding, and they're asking for more governance and more responsibility to be taken in terms of the types of levels of governance that's available in the final result.
Mm. I really like that idea that you shared of governance as a way of measurement. And like across different projects, whether they're more in academia, more in the corporate sphere, smaller, larger, there is going to be a spectrum of different governance approaches, whether it's for a regulator, whether it's more in a private sense. And that takes us nicely to the next question, which is how can folks determine what type or level of governance their project and community requires? In the call that we had previously, we spoke about minimum viable governance. What is something like that? What does it mean to you and the projects that you work on? Who would like to start?
I feel bad that you're always taking it, Dawn. So I'm not ready, but I can take this one. The main thing I would do if I was thinking, what kind of governance do I need, is look around at similar projects. That's just the easiest way to figure out what I need to do. And the reason I say that is, again, because I find open source really difficult to conceptualize as a topic. And so every single time I think, it depends, which is, you know, a really lawyerly answer. But like, I don't know. I don't know what your project is. If it's a small project that has 3 contributors, you probably don't need to think about governance that much. That's okay. You have a license on it? Cool. If it's a project that has millions of users, you probably should think about tax restrictions and whether you need a 501c3 and what the board should look like and whether they should be an active board or an inactive board. And you should probably be emailing other people and talking to them about, hey, do I really want to set up here? And how does that work? And that's the best way you're going to find answers to those questions. There's no guide to setting up a foundation for an open source software. And there probably shouldn't be, because it changes so often. And so it's really difficult to answer that question. So at any given point, ask yourself, where am I and where do I need to be? I wish I had a better answer than that. I feel like I'm the kind of person who's like, but yeah, can someone else clarify? Maybe.
If I may build on that, and I'm going to leave Dawn to do the final one here because she's got all the details, so there'll be loads we've missed, right? But so I love the "it depends." That's always the best answer for so many things these days. But I will add on to what Richard's saying, because I think it completely depends, and everything you were saying there is like 100%. And then maybe I'll add on an additional one. So maybe not just even where you're at, but where you want to go. So I think it's really interesting to start thinking about not just the projects that are like you, but if you're thinking about trying to be the, top project in a given area, like when you're thinking about the adoption of a particular project, there may be additional things you can do, which may be above and beyond what is even minimum viable or even needed or even commonly done, but it could potentially really give the extra safety feeling to other people that this is exactly the project that's for me. And maybe that's some sort of documentation checklist or a software bill of materials or whatever it might be that is like the emerging best in class governance kind of approach that can potentially turbo boost the success of projects in a given domain. And I think for me, it's a really interesting thing that these days, it's not just the best technology that wins, but it's the technology that has maybe most paperwork done around it. In some certain circumstances, that may be the factor that makes it win, right? That you've done your whatever. I heard one in a government context where they had, for a particular government, this piece of open source software had done all the necessary reports on privacy and like the data things. And just because they attached an example template of that, the thing went wild within government, because it was kind of like, well, at least I don't have to do that again for this one. So it turns into being an actual feature of the project as well. So I'll pass over to Dawn now because I'm sure that's only a tiny amount of all the various different areas.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd add, so a couple of people mentioned sort of minimum viable governance, and I really do recommend that projects stick with the simplest possible governance model to start off with. because if you pick something really, so a lot of people will they'll look at big projects. They're like, oh, I want to be like the Turing Way, or I want to be like Kubernetes or something. And they're like, and they have steering committees and, you know, technical oversight groups, and they've got all of this structure. And like Richard said, a small project with 3 people does not need an elected steering committee. For example, what what you need is a documented decision-making model where those 3 people have some method of making decisions and breaking ties if there's, you know, if there's some conflict within those people. So start with something super simple, because governance will always evolve. And when that super simple governance um, starts to not work very well, I think you usually start to recognize that, you know, there's too much going on for those people to make all of the decisions, or, you know, you need more expertise in a particular area, or, you know, you start to realize what else you need, and then it's easier to modify it from there. Because if you start with something super complex, you're going to spend a whole bunch of time working on governance paperwork when you really should be working on making the thing actually work. So just start simple. That's my biggest piece of advice.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, please.
Well, I just want to add in my experience as well, I've been part of some groups that have, you know, spent a lot of time documenting all this, and then you get to the problem of we've documented it all, but we don't even all know what we've documented. So someone was in charge of documenting a governance process, but then there's a constant effort to keep people aware of what the governance process is, and where you have to post your minutes and how many people give you quorum and all this sort of thing. And it seems to be a constant education as well. So it is a huge overhead. So the return on investment for that is probably something that every individual project needs to.
And talk to some people who've done this before, because there are some common ways of doing governance. And I see too often, I look at governance models, governance documents that people who don't have much experience have written. And sometimes I just cringe. I'm like, oh, that's not going to work. And so talk to some people who know things about governance. There are loads of us out there, and we're generally really happy to talk to people so that they don't get themselves into the messes that, you know, we've all been in the past.
Thank you, Oscar, for your comment in the chat. You perfectly preempted the next question about trigger points. How can folks know when it is time to switch between governance models? And on the flip side, when is a bad time to switch governance models? Richard, would you like to start again?
I'd say if the emotional labor is taking up most of your time, it's probably a time to think about governance models. And that's because governance isn't just about who owns the code and what the copyright is. It also means things like code of conduct. That's part of your governance. If one person is doing a lot of extra work on the side that's not coding work, you probably need to think about your governance model. If your entire, you know, board is having to meet every second day for 2-hour conversations, you need to think about maybe having a different type of board. If none of you can get any work done because you've been trying, you have like one call every month and the project just isn't really getting any further, and you can't remember what happened in the last one, you probably need to think about a governance model in the sense of maybe choosing a secretary to take notes or something like that. So it's often when things are starting to break down, when there's duplicated effort, when there's effort which is broken, or really when there's emotional labor. That's one of the ways I see it, because we're made to realize when things aren't going well. We're really good at that as a species. And so when things aren't going well collectively, sit down and be like, okay, we need to figure out what's another way of doing this. They don't teach emotional training 101 in any open source class that I know of, which is kind of a shame, because I just reference that as like the main litmus test. But that's okay, because we have this training in the rest of our lives. So that's something I would say is where this maybe comes in, for what the inflection points are. There are also other inflection points, like if you get a lawsuit. That's a really clear inflection point. You should probably be prepared for that and or know what to do. But that's unlikely for most of the people in this call, so I wouldn't worry about it. But the main thing is just when things start breaking down.
Yeah, just building on that. It's when the people processes seem really, really difficult that you probably need to change something about your governance model. And getting at the flip side of that question, the worst time to do it is when it's too late and you're already in conflict. So this is why putting some super simple governance in place early in the project is really important, because you define the decision-making structures. I also strongly recommend that people have a way to remove even leaders, maintainers from the project, because things happen and stuff goes wrong. And if you don't have a process to remove someone, I've seen this get really, really painful in communities. So these are the things you put in place and hope that you just never need. But if you put them in place early, then you're not trying to design your governance model when your whole community is in conflict, which is the hardest possible and possibly impossible time to do something like that.
Thanks, Dawn. And I will build on that by referring to your very talk that we heard in the Open Source Summit, which was brilliant. If you haven't seen it, I think it's now live on power dynamics. And for me, this idea of power dynamics and how like that being a kind of a, thinking about governance in that respect, like what are the power dynamics? And then I suppose another scenario, apart from what Dawn and Richard were talking about, like preventative or when something goes wrong, is just like when things feel a bit off, like where people are leaving and there's nothing that's being like announced as a crisis, and it's not that you're doing this preemptively, but you're just kind of thinking the power dynamics just feel a bit off here. I'm not feeling welcome. Or if you're getting that kind of vibe as well from a community, it can be sometimes a really good time to potentially think, well, maybe if those power dynamics are off, that's possibly because the governance power is in the wrong place or not evenly distributed or something like that. And yeah, I'll just point to Dawn's talk for that because it was really great. And thank you for sharing the link. And I will also say that back to this previous idea that you might be wanting to maybe redirect the purpose of the project or break into a new area in terms of usage, then you may need to up-level your governance. So a lot of the discussion that's happening at a kind of a regional level, or say if you're if like the trends that are happening in some regulated markets are that like there's sweeps going on of the code people are using to ensure that they are meeting certain criteria, like keeping an eye on that. If that's what your goal is in terms of where your project is used, then that would be a good scenario. And I think when we think about academic software, that becomes much more specific. Like oftentimes people are doing research outputs, they're going for a particular domain. Like the governance requirements for a biomedical piece of software is maybe very different than what might be there if you're just building a kind of a my favorite, scratching your own itch in some other respect. Or if you're building something that's going into an automated, software-defined vehicle project, then that may be very different in terms of what level of governance you may want to think about putting there. Or even down to this conversation that's happening often these days about the risk of, say, using a single vendor project or a project where a single vendor is the primary I suppose, controller of the project versus maybe putting it into a more democratic foundation or some other model. So sometimes these are the things that are maybe blocking the project getting where it needs to go.
Thank you. Those were incredibly helpful insights. Listening to your gut, having an instinct when something's not working, thinking about power dynamics, and to Dawn's point as well, that if something's going awry, that is not a time to be changing. And so you want to think critically about what governance structures work for you and your project as a proactive, preventative thing. And the governance is working when you don't have these issues, which is great to think about. The next question is, how does governance of projects, in your experience, factor into the overall conversation about the sustainability of open source across academia and industry? And one thing that I'll add to that is, how does that change at the intersection or in contrasting academia and industry, how the approaches may differ? Who would like to start with this one?
Well, I just might mention just on that particular point about the differences. I suppose just to kind of talk about the potential scenarios which may be different in academic open source in some areas that may be happening in the corporate world. So just off a call where we were discussing the idea of student programs and student outputs or outputs in open source from student work. And I suppose one of the points that was being described there is that sometimes the student participants might only be coming into that project for a particular period of time. So there's a very short time where you may have a formal engagement with them or something in terms of that, but they may be coming in and then maybe leaving in a couple of weeks. And I think maybe the governance and the scenarios or the level of, I suppose, engagement you have with those people as contributors to a particular project may have to be different than if, for example, you're building a long-term sustainable community where you're assuming that people are there for the long haul, and therefore you've got a kind of a consistent norm or community norm that you can build over time. So it may be that we may need to look at different potential ways of kind of building community norms in very short-term projects in that particular academic scenario. So I'll just add that as one example.
I think going back to the earlier question around how does governance fit into sustainability, sustainability is a really tough word to define. Generally, if we think about sustainability, it's like its easiest definition is like we want this thing to keep going and we want it to go in a way that's useful and to have the project continue. I actually want to disagree with something Jen said, or maybe change it a bit, which is that you're going to have conflict. Conflict happens all the time, and conflict is actually very healthy, and that's totally okay. People should have conflict because that's how humans work. We get in the way of each other all the time. Governance is there to make it easier. Your governance platform should make it easier for you to deal with conflict faster in a way where everyone feels happy, or at least not totally sad. So like that's kind of how I think about sustainability as well. The main person is going to have to leave. If we imagine that every project lasts for 500 years, humans don't live that long. So someone's going to have to replace that person, right? And so the governance should help make that happen. Now, normally with open source projects, the person wants to leave around a week before they started, or realistically, maybe once, every 3 years or something, they want to go and do something else. And so the governance plan should have a plan for figuring out how should that change. And so governance is really integral to sustainability because when projects die, when projects sunset, when projects need to be mothballed, when they move on to different projects, the governance outline, whether it's the code of conduct, whether it's the governance MD, whether it's conversations you've had with the other maintainers, whether it's just a handshake you have with your co-founder in a coffee shop and you walk away never to see each other again, the governance process will help make that easier. And if we're talking about sustainability in terms of funding, because we live in a capitalist society and money is very useful for incentivizing people to do stuff, having governance works really well for getting funding in the first place. Because if money is flowing to you, someone else has decided this is a good place to put my money instead of somewhere else. And so having any sort of governance is an excellent way to say, hello, I know what I'm talking about. Please pay me. So it's integral. It's like the main part of sustainability is figuring these things out.
That was an excellent point, Richard. Both that sustainability is a quite vague term, like sustainability, governance. So many of these terms in this space are vague, and it's very much how it is defined in your individual context. And thank you also for your point about conflict can be constructive. I appreciated the meta-ness of disagreement, but it being constructive in this context as well. That was a very important point to make. Dawn, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I want to agree with everything that Richard and Claire said. The only thing that I would add is, and I think you kind of alluded to this in your answers, but I do think when you're defining governance structures, you really do need to think about the different incentivization systems. That's not a word. How people are incentivized in corporate environments and how people are incentivized in academic environments. Because they're very different. And in some cases, the goals are very different. And I think you have to be careful to design a governance structure that's going to work with the way that people are paid, the way that the grant, system works, the way that PhD students come in and out of software development. And in a lot of cases, the fact that, people, researchers are working on software out of the good of their hearts, because what they're really getting measured on is paper production, which isn't necessarily, as a software maintainer. So thinking about how your governance structures reflect the type of people that you have in your environment, and how that might be different than, between corporate projects and academic or scientific software.
And if I may add on that one, and then again, that particular scenario, another type of scenario that I think is really interesting to also explore is where you have those different communities meet. So for example, if you do have collaborative projects where researchers are working with corporations, both of whom may have different expectations of what good governance looks like, because they are different audiences with different motivations. And it's an area where I'm not sure I've seen good explorations of where that conflict may arise, or the points of difference where that may come on board. But I think as we're starting to see more formal and bigger projects be started and funded because there is a move towards supporting open source and development in the open, and this kind of collaborative work, maybe even multi-stakeholders like governments and academics and folks that may be coming from the corporate world, then there really is, I suppose, a need for perhaps even more work to be done to help template how that might look and to accommodate for those different goals and purposes.
We've had a lot of reflections about how people could go about governance, thinking about what criteria they might keep in mind when designing those different systems and processes. The next question is, what do you see as a key challenge for open source governance that, in your opinion, isn't getting sufficient attention at the moment? Dawn, would you like to start?
No, I want to think about this one for a minute. Let Claire or Richard start.
It's really annoying because I really wanted to say something, but I wanted you to start. Because my main issue is the lack of standardization. And I know that Dawn has worked on standardizing governance models, which is why I didn't want to say that, because I wanted Dawn to introduce her standards first. But of course she can't, because she's not annoyed by them, because she's already done it. So I guess to cheat around that is the lack of uptake of standardization for governance models is something that's really hampering the field at large. I would argue the lack of understanding of what open source means and the lack of understanding of what sustainability means are also equally hampering the field. I really don't like the fact that the open source initiative is really controversial at the moment because of their movements into building an AI definition that was pushed through, and it is controversial, right? Even if you like it or not, you can't deny that it's controversial. That's an issue with the field, because it's hard right now to figure out what open source is and how it works. It's really hard to know what open source is when companies like OpenAI go around saying we're open source and they're not. That's tough. And when you think about your average project, you can't even, because there's like 15 million projects on GitHub. I don't even know the number, but that sounds right. It's really, really hard to figure out how to reach every single developer to teach them about basic things, like how to file a 1090. Okay, that's not a basic thing, but basic things like how to get governance.md up, right? And what should be in there, and whether your code of conduct matters or not. And so really just a common pattern language is something that I think that we really need. And I think we need to work on really well. Now, CHAOSS is really well placed to do that, because that's kind of their job, is to figure out how to build metrics and make things work. And so good work, Dawn, you're the best. And I would love to see more coming out of that sort of space. But we also then need to go on a lot more panels and a lot more discussions and talk to a lot more projects and just make it clear that, oh, these are the languages we use. Like I said, I've done like 300 podcasts now on open source, or hosted with many, many people about open source sustainability. And at the end of every podcast, it's kind of turned into a joke. We're like, well, the issue is capitalism. And that's a real cop-out, because it isn't. The issue is our understanding of what's going on and us thinking about like how to actually conceptualize, okay, here's my open source project, here's where I want it to be, here's where it should be, and here's the governance pattern that's going to get us there, assuming goodwill and good intent and good effort. I just want that language to be filled in better, and I haven't done it yet, and it annoys me and makes me sad. I'm going to stop talking. Claire, Dawn, what annoys you?
Well, before we get to Dawn solving all our problems, which obviously is on the to-do list now, I'll just add in that yes, and because the standardization and that idea of understanding not just what the standards are, but how to implement them, like where are the best patterns and practices. And I think someone in the chat was mentioning about the, do you put everyone on a training? That seems a bit overkill. So what are the ways in which you actually build a kind of a governance muscle? Not just here's what it should look like, but how do you actually go from wherever you are to wherever you want to be in governance? That's also a challenge. And then I will add in back to what we were talking about earlier, that in that effort to standardize, it's really hard to also kind of go, and then it depends. So after we've told you all about what it does, now we have to talk about the different scenarios and what your project's like and where it's going to be and what your audience is or who your participants are. And so like you're even just starting on a long journey there. So now over to Dawn, who'll tell us all how to go on this long journey.
Oh my. And I'm afraid to say anything. No, I do. So I am a big fan of governance templates because there are some basic standard things that really people should just have in their governance models. And we built some of these for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which I think are probably linked in the doc somewhere. And we built these for like three main categories of projects where, smaller projects, the maintainers get to make the decision. That's kind of a maintainer council model. Once you get bigger, maybe you have an elected steering committee model, or maybe you've got a really complex project with lots of sub-projects. And so we did these three templates. And I think, they can be generalized, they can be modified. You can use some, kind of some mix of the three templates. And those were a good start, but they're a little specific to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. But what I also see, unfortunately, is there are so many bad examples of governance that continue to proliferate because someone is like, oh, well, this project's similar to me, I'm just going to copy their governance model. And so they copy a governance model that's terrible. And we had this problem even within the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. We had these great templates, and people would come to us to do a governance review as, someone who was on the governance working group. And I'd be like, so how'd you come up with this? Oh, we copied it from X project. And I'm like, yeah, we've been talking to that project about how their governance sucks. So maybe you should have used our template or a different project as your example. So, and there was one website that was circulating recently that I don't remember the URL. And even if I did, I wouldn't say it because I think they used AI to build this website, and somebody I know recognized some of their work that was included in these templates, stuff they had written, and the templates were unlicensed. And people were passing this around like, here's some great governance templates. And the templates themselves actually weren't bad, but they weren't licensed. There was no attribution from where they got this stuff from. And so you don't know, like the person I was talking to was like, I don't care if they use it, but they should attribute it. And so you've got all of this stuff around governance. So you've got people copying bad templates. You've got people writing them from scratch who aren't governance experts. And that's also kind of a recipe for problems. So there are some, don't roll your own governance, Richard. That's exactly it. There's lots of templates, lots of things you can use and as a starting point and modify it to suit the needs of your particular community and the type of audience that you have. But yeah, don't start from scratch.
Thank you, Dawn. That's an excellent place to end things for the formal part of the discussion. Thank you also for the mention of the Cloud Native Computing resources. If the three of you have any suggested resources for folks looking to get started in governance, it would be great if you could drop them in the chat, and that's something that we can pick up on in the Q&A. But for now, I'll pass over to Arielle to do the Q&A.
Hello. Goodbye to everyone who is watching this recording and catching up. I'm afraid you'll just have to have FOMO. We're going to stop the recording now.